On February 14, 2025, the state of Texas carried out the execution of Richard Lee Tabler by lethal injection. His death came nearly 20 years after his conviction and placement on death row. In the following minutes, we'll examine the key elements of this case, what led to the killings, what Tabler ate before his final moment, and the words he chose to leave behind. For most, the story of Richard Tabler begins on Thanksgiving Day in the small city of Killings, Texas. But the chain of events was already in motion 1 week earlier on November 18, 2004. At the time, Tabler was 25 years old. That day, he had a serious falling out with Muhammad Amina Ramouni, the manager of a local strip club known as Teasers, and his former employer. According to Tabler, the dispute turned threatening when Muhammad allegedly made remarks about harming his family. Whether the threat was real or imagined, Tabler took it seriously. From that point forward, he began planning a response not immediate, but deliberate. Over the following days, Tabler gathered what he needed: a 9mm handgun, a video camcorder, and a borrowed pickup truck. By the night of Thanksgiving, he was ready. While families across the country were finishing dinner and watching football, Tabler made a phone call. He contacted Muhammad with a business offer, used stereo equipment at a low price. No questions asked. Muhammad agreed to meet, unaware of what was waiting for him. Around 2:00 a.m., Muhammad arrived, but he wasn't alone. He was driven by a friend, Hayam Zed. The two pulled into a quiet business parking lot, expecting a routine exchange. Unbeknownst to them, Tabler and his 18-year-old associate, Timothy Payne, were already parked in the shadows waiting for their arrival. As soon as Hayam's car came to a stop, Richard Tabler made his move. He raised the 9mm handgun and opened fire. Hayam Zed, the driver, was hit first. Muhammad Ramouni was next. The ambush happened quickly and without warning. But the shooting didn't end there. Tabler stepped out of the pickup and approached the vehicle. He pulled both men from the car. When he noticed that Muhammad was still alive, injured, but conscious, he fired again at close range. This final shot ended Muhammad's life. Standing nearby was Timothy Payne, Tabler's 18-year-old accomplice. He had a video camera in hand and recorded the entire incident as it unfolded. After the shooting, Tabler reached into the victim's car. He took what he could find: a wallet, a small black bag, and anything else of value. Then he disappeared into the night. Later that same evening, Tabler returned home and described the killings to his roommate in disturbing detail. According to reports, he treated it like a story worth retelling, sharing what had happened, and even showing the video Timothy had recorded. That footage was later destroyed. Not long after, Tabler made a call to the Bell County Sheriff's Office. He identified himself and confessed to the shootings. But what stood out wasn't just the admission, it was what came after. He told the dispatcher plainly and without hesitation that he had killed them. And then he added something else. He said he wasn't finished. 2 days after the first killings, Richard Tabler acted again. Authorities would later discover that the double homicide on Thanksgiving night had not been spontaneous. Tabler had created a list, 11 names in total. According to him, every individual on that list had a connection to Teasers, the strip club where Muhammad Ramouni had worked, and every one of them, in his view, was a target. At the top of the list were two teenage girls, 18-year-old Tiffany Dodson and 16-year-old Amanda Benfield. On the night of November 28, 2004, Tabler lured both girls into his vehicle. The exact details of how he convinced them remain unclear. Some reports suggest he promised drugs. Others describe it as an invitation to hang out or escape town. Whatever the reason, both Tiffany and Amanda agreed to go. Tabler drove them to a remote lakeside area far from the city, far from anyone who could intervene. Once there, the situation turned fatal. Tabler retrieved the same firearm he had used days earlier and opened fire. He shot both girls multiple times. When it was over, he left their bodies behind and drove away. Investigators later concluded that Tabler believed the two had betrayed him. In his mind, they may have been the ones who alerted police after the initial killings. Whether or not that was true has never been definitively proven. But to Tabler, the belief alone was justification. He saw himself as judge, jury, and executioner. The next day, an employee with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers stumbled upon the bodies near the lake. Tiffany Dodson was identified almost immediately. Amanda Benfield, however, remained unnamed for over a week. It wasn't until December 4th that law enforcement confirmed her identity. Amanda had run away from home months earlier. She was originally reported missing in Louisiana. At just 16 years old, she had become entangled in a world she couldn't fully understand and crossed paths with the wrong person at the worst possible time. On the same day Tiffany and Amanda were killed, Richard Tabler was taken into custody. But it wasn't for murder. At the time of his arrest, police were pursuing him on an unrelated felony theft charge. Authorities had not yet connected him to the double homicide just hours earlier or to the Thanksgiving night shootings that had taken place days before. Even so, the timing raised concerns. Investigators were already looking into the deaths of Mohammed Ramouni and Hayam Zed, and Tabler's name had surfaced early in the inquiry. Once in custody, he was questioned, and during the interview, he didn't hold back. Tabler confessed not to one, but to all 4 killings. He described the events in detail, from the ambush in the parking lot to the remote location near the lake. He admitted to pulling the trigger in each instance. And he gave investigators the name of an accomplice, Timothy Payne. According to Tabler, Payne had not only been present during the Thanksgiving shootings, he had filmed them. The camcorder footage, though reportedly destroyed soon after, became a critical piece of corroboration during the early phase of the investigation. Following Tabler's statement, police moved quickly. Within hours, they located and arrested Timothy Payne. He was just 18 years old. Despite the confession, Tabler would later change his plea in court, claiming he was not guilty. He said the confession had been coerced and that he had fabricated his earlier statements. But the details he had already provided and the physical evidence that followed would prove difficult to walk back. On November 30th, 2004, both Tabler and Payne were formally charged with 2 counts of capital murder for the Thanksgiving night killings. A little over a week later, Tabler was charged again, this time for the murders of Tiffany Dodson and Amanda Benfield. By that point, the case had shifted from a local tragedy to a full-scale capital prosecution. Richard Tabler's case moved swiftly through the legal system. On March 21, 2007, more than 2 years after his arrest, the courtroom in Bell County, Texas, began hearing the full account of what had happened in November 2004. Prosecutors presented witness statements, forensic evidence, and excerpts from Tabler's own confession. They outlined the planning, the execution, and the motivations behind both sets of killings. The defense attempted to shift the narrative, suggesting that Tabler's confession had been made under pressure and that his mental health history warranted closer scrutiny. They pointed to a background of childhood instability, academic struggles, and early signs of behavioral disorders, but the jury remained unconvinced. On April 2, 2007, after less than 2 weeks of testimony, the verdict was announced. Richard Tabler was found guilty of capital murder in connection with the deaths of Mohammed Ramouni and Hayam Zed. The sentence was death. Though Tabler had also been charged in the killings of Tiffany Dodson and Amanda Benfield, prosecutors elected not to pursue those charges separately. With the capital verdict already secured, and with Tabler now facing death row, additional trials were deemed unnecessary. Timothy Payne's case proceeded more slowly. His trial began later that same year. On November 13, 2007, prosecutors presented the evidence tying him to the Thanksgiving night murders, including Tabler's statements and Payne's presence at the scene. 2 days later, the jury delivered its decision. Payne was found guilty of both murders. Unlike Tabler, he was not sentenced to death. Instead, he received life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated at the Memorial Unit in Texas. Under current sentencing laws, he will not be eligible for parole until the year 2044 after serving at least 40 years behind bars. With both convictions secured, the courtroom phase of the case concluded. But for Richard Tabler, the legal fight was far from over. Following his sentencing, Richard Tabler was transferred to death row at the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas. There, like all death-sentenced inmates in the state, he was placed in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, with limited contact and strict supervision. In the years that followed, Tabler's behavior drew mixed attention from both prison officials and the public. At times, he expressed a willingness to accept his sentence. He told reporters that he was ready to die, that he had made peace with the outcome. But those statements were inconsistent. In other moments, he filed multiple appeals, challenged his legal representation, and raised claims related to mental illness and due process violations. None of the legal motions were successful. Every appeal was denied. But what drew the most attention both inside and outside the prison system was an incident in 2008, 3 years after his conviction. That year, Tabler obtained a contraband cell phone. Inmates are strictly prohibited from possessing phones of any kind, and smuggling them into high-security facilities is considered a major breach of protocol. What Tabler did with the phone would spark a statewide controversy. He used it to call Texas State Senator John Whitmire, not once, but multiple times. And during those calls, Tabler didn't ask for legal help or clemency. Instead, he issued direct threats against the senator and his family. The phone calls triggered an immediate lockdown across all Texas prison units. The story made national headlines and prompted a full investigation into how death row inmates were able to access contraband. For Tabler, the calls effectively ended any lingering public sympathy he might have retained. Whatever arguments had been made about remorse, rehabilitation, or mental health were overshadowed by the deliberate nature of the threats. Though he remained on death row for many more years, the 2008 phone incident marked a turning point, one that hardened public and institutional attitudes toward him for good. In the years after the 2008 phone incident, Richard Tabler remained on death row. Over time, his public image shifted from that of a dangerous and unpredictable inmate to someone claiming personal transformation. He told journalists he had found faith. He began writing and drawing through a prison-based correspondence program. He met a woman who would later become his wife. In letters and interviews, she described Tabler as thoughtful, remorseful, and deeply spiritual, someone far removed from the man described in court. Even some correctional staff acknowledged his change in behavior. One incident, in particular, stood out. During a routine cell cleaning, Tabler noticed a small lizard crawling along the wall. Rather than ignore it or kill it, he fed it, named it Little Blue, and allowed it to live in his cell. Guards reported seeing the lizard climb across his shoulders or rest on his head, and said Tabler cared for it with surprising gentleness. Still, for many outside the prison system, these gestures didn't outweigh the past. 4 people were dead, and no personal evolution could undo what had already been done. In late 2024, an execution date was set. On February 14, 2025, 8 days after his 46th birthday, Richard Lee Tabler was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. Like all Texas death row inmates, he was not permitted to select a special last meal. He received the standard prison dinner. In his final statement, Tabler addressed the victims' families. He expressed regret, said he had no right to take anyone's life, and asked for forgiveness. He also thanked his attorneys, his family, and several members of the prison staff. His final words to the warden were simply, "I am finished." At 6:38 p.m., he was pronounced dead.